The rain was falling over the city when the signal came. People on the streets kept moving, unaware that far above the clouds, an urgent message was racing toward Earth. In the Capitol building, the control room was filled with the soft hum of machines. A young operator named Daniel leaned forward, eyes wide as strange words scrolled across his screen. It was a distress call. The voice was broken, the sound shaking with fear, but the meaning was clear. Human colony far beyond the outer rim was under attack, and they were asking for help. Daniel called for the commander at once. Within minutes, the message was placed before Queen Elizabeth, ruler of the Human Alliance. She read it in silence, her eyes hard. She knew that if they did nothing, the colony would fall. It was not just about one place.
Ow.
It was about the promise they had made to protect every human world. She sent for Jack Morris, a soldier who had been retired for years. Jack was living quietly in the countryside, trying to leave the past behind. When the royal guards arrived at his door, he knew before they spoke that something terrible had happened. In the capital, the Queen met him in a private chamber. She told him about the distress call and how the colony was under siege by ruthless human warlords who had turned against the Alliance. Jack listened without interrupting. Da-da-da. His hands were folded, but his jaw was tight. He had seen war before, but the thought of humans turning on their own filled him with a deep anger. The Queen looked at him and said they needed someone who could lead and inspire others. Jack agreed, knowing there was no other choice. The Queen called the High Council together. The great hall was filled with leaders from across the Alliance. She spoke clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. She told them of the call for help, the danger the colony faced, and the duty they had to respond. Her words were sharp and full of resolve. There would be no hesitation. They would send the largest fleet in Earth's history. In the military docks, engineers and soldiers worked through the night. Massive warships stood ready, their hulls shining under the floodlights. The air was thick with the smell of fuel and the sound of heavy machinery. Crews moved supplies, weapons, and equipment aboard. Soldiers tested their rifles and adjusted their armor. There was no doubt that they were going to war. Jack was assigned to the flagship, a vessel large enough to carry thousands of troops. On board, he met Claire Harris, a young but brilliant tactician whose calm mind could see through the chaos of battle. She had studied every known tactic used by the enemy. Luke Carter, a fearless pilot with unmatched skill, joined them as well. Luke had a grin that never seemed to fade, even when danger was close. They gathered in the strategy room, a wide space filled with holographic maps and mission data. Claire explained the enemy's movements, showing how they had surrounded the colony. Luke talked about possible flight paths to break through. Jack listened, asking questions, shaping a plan in his mind. Meanwhile, the Queen made her final preparations. She recorded a message to be sent to every ship in the fleet. Her words promised that Earth would never abandon its people, no matter how far away they were. She told them that the strength of Earth was not in its weapons, but in its unity. As the hour of departure neared, the docks became even busier. The noise of engines grew louder, the lights brighter. Soldiers hugged their families, shaking hands and promising to return. Jack walked through the crowds, watching the faces of the men and women who would follow him into battle. He saw fear in some eyes, determination in others. At last, the order came. The fleet began to rise from the docks, one massive ship after another lifting into the night sky. The city lights fell away beneath them. Through the viewports, stars filled the blackness ahead. Jack stood beside Claire and Luke, his mind fixed on the colony and the people waiting for them. The distress call had been answered. Earth was moving with all its strength, and nothing would stop them from reaching their own. The fleet moved through the dark space like a long line of steel giants. Each ship carried thousands of soldiers, and every heart on board was focused on the same mission. Jack stood near the main window of the flagship, watching the stars slide past. It had been years since he had traveled with a fleet this large. The silence of space was almost peaceful, but he knew the peace would not last. Claire sat at a large table, going over maps and data. She studied every report from scouts and tried to guess the enemy's next move. Luke stood beside her, leaning over the table with his usual grin. He enjoyed the thought of flying into danger, but Jack knew Luke's skills came from years of hard training. Every day, the soldiers trained in the ship's large halls. They ran drills, practiced combat, and prepared for boarding actions. The sound of boots hitting the metal floor echoed through the corridors. Jack joined them when he could, testing his own speed and strength. He spoke to the troops, telling them stories from his past battles. His words carried weight, and the younger soldiers listened closely. Messages from the colony reached them through broken transmissions. The enemy warlords had surrounded the main city. Supplies were running out, and the defenders were losing ground. Jack felt the urgency grow with each update. Claire marked the enemy's positions on the map, her eyes narrowing as she worked out a path for their arrival. One evening, the Queen's voice came through the ship's speakers. She addressed every man and woman in the fleet. Her message was clear. They would not stop until the colony was safe. Her words brought silence to the training halls. Soldiers stood still, listening to the calm strength in her voice. Jack could see the effect it had on them. Fear was replaced with determination. During the journey, small encounters broke the long travel. Scouts found enemy outposts on drifting stations and small moons. These were quickly taken down by fast strikes. Luke often led the fighter squadrons during these skirmishes, returning with damage on his ship, but always with victory in hand. Each win boosted the fleet's morale. Jack worked closely with Claire to refine their battle plan. They decided to split the fleet when they reached the colony's edge. Luke would lead a wing of fighters to attack from above, while the main force would push through the blockade. Claire would guide the movement of the ships from the flagship, and Jack would lead the first wave of troops on the ground. The fleet's corridors were never quiet. Mechanics worked on weapons, pilots checked their ships, and medics prepared for the wounded. The smell of oil and metal filled the air. In the mess hall, soldiers shared meals and quiet conversations. Some wrote messages to their families knowing they might not return. Jack moved among them, speaking in short but steady words. He reminded them that they fought for people who could not fight for themselves. As they drew closer to the colony, enemy patrols became more frequent. One night, alarms rang through the flagship. 2 enemy cruisers had appeared on the edge of their path. Luke and his squadron were sent out at once. From the strategy room, Jack and Claire watched the battle unfold on the screens. Luke's fighters weaved between the enemy ships, dodging fire and striking hard. In minutes, both cruisers were destroyed, and the path was clear again. The next day, the fleet received one last desperate message from the colony. The voice was weak, almost breaking. The defenders said they might not last another week. Jack felt the weight of those words. He tightened his fists and told Claire and Luke that they would arrive in time no matter what. Days later, the dark shape of the colony's planet appeared in the distance. Fires could be seen from orbit, bright against the surface. Enemy ships moved like shadows around the world, holding their grip tight. The fleet slowed as it approached, ready to break through. Jack stood with Claire and Luke in the command deck. The order to engage was coming. The long journey was over. The battle to save the colony was about to begin. The colony's planet grew larger in the viewports, until it filled the glass with smoke and fire. The enemy blockade was a wall of steel and guns circling the world. Jack stood with his hands behind his back, watching every move on the screens. Claire was at the strategy table, giving orders to the fleet. Luke sat in the pilot chair of his fighter, waiting for the command to launch. The moment came. The Queen's voice was calm and steady over the comms as she told them to strike. Luke's squadron roared out of the hangar, engines burning bright in the darkness. They moved like arrows toward the enemy line, weaving between heavy fire. Luke called out targets to his squadron, his voice sharp and confident. Explosions lit the black sky as enemy ships broke apart under the attack. Meanwhile, the main fleet pushed forward. The flagship's guns opened fire, shaking the deck under Jack's feet. Claire directed the formation, sending smaller ships to flank the enemy and open a path for the troop carriers. The battle outside was a storm of light and metal. When the first gap opened in the blockade, Jack and his soldiers boarded the carriers. Engines roared, and the carrier shot toward the planet's surface. Enemy fire followed them down, but the escorts held the attackers off. The view through the small windows changed from black space to thick clouds, then to burning streets below. The carriers landed hard, ramps dropping as soldiers ran out into chaos. Smoke filled the air, and the sound of gunfire was constant. Jack shouted orders, his voice cutting through the noise. They moved street by street, clearing enemy forces and securing safe paths for the civilians. Claire coordinated from the ship, feeding Jack information on enemy positions. Luke, having broken through the enemy lines above, dove his fighter into the lower atmosphere. He provided air support, blasting enemy vehicles and strongholds as Jack's team advanced. His ship moved fast, leaving trails of fire in the sky. The colony's capital was a city of ruined buildings and desperate defenders. The local guards, worn and injured, joined Jack's forces as they pushed toward the center. Jack saw the faces of families hiding in broken houses, their eyes wide with both fear and hope. He told his men to protect them at all costs. Every step forward was met with resistance. The enemy had set up barricades and sniper points. Jack led from the front, charging through a narrow street under heavy fire. His rifle barked again and again until the way was clear. He could feel the weight of the mission in every movement. From the flagship, Claire watched the map change as Jack's team gained ground. She sent reinforcements to his position and ordered supply drops for ammunition and medical aid. Mind worked quickly, seeing patterns in the chaos that others could not. Luke spotted a group of enemy reinforcements moving toward Jack's location. He pushed his fighter to the limit, cutting through the smoke and unleashing a barrage that stopped them in their tracks. Jack looked up for a moment, seeing the flash of Luke's ship overhead, and gave a short nod before moving on. Hours passed in the fight for the city. Slowly, the enemy line began to break. Jack's forces reached the central square, where the largest enemy stronghold was located. They set up heavy weapons and prepared for a final push. The defenders inside fought hard, but the combined strength of Earth's troops and the colony guards was too much. When the square was secured, Jack ordered his men to help the wounded and gather the civilians in safe zones. The people looked at them with gratitude, some unable to speak through their tears. Jack told them the battle was not over yet, but Earth was here, and they would not leave until the colony was free. As night fell over the city, fire still burned, but the sound of enemy guns had grown faint. The first clash had been costly, but they had broken through. The colony had survived the day, and now it was time to push the enemy back for good. The morning after the first battle was quiet only for a short time. Jack knew the enemy would strike back, and he was right. Just after sunrise, the sound of heavy weapons shook the ground. The enemy had regrouped and launched a surprise counterattack. Their fire tore through the outer streets, forcing Earth's soldiers to take cover. Jack gathered his commanders in the central square, gave quick, sharp orders, sending squads to hold the northern and western lines. Claire's voice came through the comms, reporting enemy troop movements and weak points in their formation. She had spotted their main command vessel in low orbit, directing the assault from above. Luke was already in the air, his fighter streaking over the rooftops. He targeted enemy artillery first, blasting them apart before they could do more damage. Smoke and fire filled the streets again, but the troops held their ground. Jack moved from one position to another, encouraging the soldiers and directing their fire. In the command center aboard the flagship, Claire studied the battle carefully. She noticed that the enemy forces were spread too thin in some areas. This gave her an idea. She sent a message to Jack, telling him they could split the enemy S-line. If they struck hard at 2 points at once, Jack agreed without hesitation. He ordered one unit to attack the eastern flank, while he led another toward the south. Luke would provide cover from above, striking enemy convoys and blocking reinforcements. The plan worked. The enemy line wavered under the sudden pressure. Luke's fighter moved like a blade through the sky, cutting off supply routes and destroying transport vehicles. Jack's unit pushed forward, street by street, until they reached the enemy's forward base. After a fierce fight, they broke through and took control. But the enemy was not finished. From the horizon, a massive enemy flagship appeared, its guns blazing. It targeted one of Earth's largest warships in orbit, tearing through its shields. Claire acted fast, ordering nearby ships to shield the damaged vessel. Jack heard the call and knew they needed to stop that flagship before it destroyed more of the fleet. Jack assembled a boarding party. It would launch from the surface, breach the enemy vessel, and take control of it from the inside. It was a dangerous move, but there was no other way. The small assault ship lifted off under heavy fire, climbing toward the huge vessel hanging above. They crashed through one of its docking bays and stormed inside. The halls were narrow and filled with enemy soldiers, but Jack's team fought with precision and speed. Blaster fire lit the dark corridors as they pushed toward the control deck. When they reached it, Jack engaged the enemy captain in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Every strike was fueled by the memory of the colony's suffering. At last, the captain fell, and the remaining crew surrendered. With the flagship captured, Claire quickly redirected its weapons to fire on the enemy forces below. The tide of battle turned in Earth's favor. Soldiers on the ground cheered as the enemy began to retreat toward the outskirts of the city. Still, the Queen's voice came over the comms, reminding everyone that the fight was not yet won. They needed to press the advantage and end the threat completely. Jack regrouped his forces and pushed forward, chasing the retreating enemy into the countryside beyond the capital. Luke flew ahead, scouting enemy positions and relaying them to Claire, who adjusted troop movements in real time. Every decision pushed the enemy further back, cutting off their escape routes. By nightfall, the enemy had been driven far from the city. But their main stronghold still stood, heavily fortified and bristling with weapons. Jack stood on a hill overlooking the enemy base. Fires burned in the distance, and the sounds of war carried through the night air. He knew the next day would bring the final battle. Luke landed his fighter nearby, climbing out with a tired grin. Claire's voice came through the comms, steady and certain, telling them the final attack plan was ready. The enemy had thrown everything they had into this fight, but Earth's strength had only grown. Tomorrow, they would end it. The final dawn over the colony was painted red by the fires still burning in the distance. Jack stood at the edge of the forward camp, looking toward the enemy stronghold. The fortress was massive, built into the side of a rocky hill, with walls of steel and heavy weapons pointing out in all directions. This was the last line of defense for the warlords who had taken the colony. Once this fell, the war would be over. Claire's voice came through the comms from the flagship. She laid out the final attack plan. The fleet would strike from orbit to weaken the defenses while ground forces hit from three sides. Luke would lead an air assault, drawing the enemy's fire and creating openings for the troops to move in. Jack gathered his soldiers. He spoke clearly and without fear. He told them that this was the fight they had been waiting for, the one that would decide the fate of thousands. Every man and woman in the camp knew what was at stake, and no one held back. The attack began with the roar of orbital guns. Beams of fire cut through the morning sky, smashing into the enemy walls. Explosions shook the ground, and thick smoke rose from the stronghold. Jack led his unit forward, sprinting across the open ground while shells burst around them. Luke's fighters screamed overhead, firing at enemy gun towers and blasting apart defensive lines. He dove low, skimming the fortress walls, and unleashed a hail of fire that tore through the gates. Jack's soldiers poured in, weapons blazing. The air was filled with the sound of battle, the sharp crack of rifles, the heavy thud of explosions, and the shouts of men pushing forward. Inside the fortress, the fighting was brutal. The enemy was desperate, knowing they had nowhere left to run. Jack moved at the front, his rifle in hand, clearing rooms and hallways one by one. The corridors were tight, and every corner could hide danger. Behind him, his troops followed closely, covering each other as they advanced. In the skies above, Luke kept the pressure on. Every time the enemy tried to regroup, his squadron struck hard, scattering their forces. He coordinated closely with Claire, who guided him to the most critical targets. Her calm voice cut through the chaos, keeping the attack organized and effective. The battle raged for hours. Slowly, the defenders were pushed back toward the command center at the heart of the stronghold. Jack kicked down the final doors and stormed inside. The enemy leader stood waiting, armed and ready. What followed was not a battle of guns, but a clash of strength and will. They fought hand to hand, each strike echoing in the steel chamber. Jack's training and determination won in the end. With one final blow, the enemy leader fell. The remaining defenders dropped their weapons, surrendering to the soldiers who had fought their way through every barrier. From the flagship, Claire confirmed that all enemy forces were in retreat or captured. Luke landed his fighter near the fortress, stepping out with a grin, despite the soot and smoke covering his face. Jack met him at the gates, and they shared a brief handshake, both knowing the cost of what they had achieved. As the sun began to set, Queen Elizabeth's voice came over the comms, broadcast to every ship and every soldier. She praised their courage and sacrifice, telling them that Earth had stood together and proved its strength. The colony was safe, and the warlords who had brought destruction would trouble no one again. In the city, civilians came out from hiding. Families reunited, tears and relief in their eyes. Soldiers helped rebuild defenses and delivered food and medicine to those in need. The streets that had been filled with fire and fear now carried the sound of life returning. That night, Jack, Claire, and Luke stood together on a balcony overlooking the city. The stars shone bright above, and the distant lights of Earth's fleet glimmered in orbit. Jack knew this was not the last time they would be called to fight, but he also knew they would be ready. The distress call that had reached Earth had unleashed its full strength, and nothing could stand against it.